Thank you. This is part of a book I'm writing called, it was going to be called Spent Bullets, The Afterimage of the Great War in Hollywood, 1919 to 1939, which I might call it that, but it gives you some sense of what I'm covering. This is bits from one chapter on veterans. I'm going to read this. I hope you don't mind. And I think I can read it fairly, so I won't put you to sleep, but you never know. Okay. In the American popular imagination, Great War veterans were carriers of the effects of the new modernity the war had brought into being. They could be the victorious embodiment of the new America as a global powerhouse, the soldiers who brought peace to Europe. At the same time, they could be infected with the lax morals and decadence of the old world and harboring the disease of revolution, either political or social or both. As the Jazz Age gave way to the Great Depression, the veteran acted as an undertone, at times an unwelcome relic of the past, at others a poignant reminder of social responsibility, but always the cipher around which competing discourses for the memory of the war and the state of the nation coalesced. The veteran then represented, at least referred to, a force that was bringing about changes across the social fabric of American life. In 1930, Frederick Lewis Allen wrote, "It was impossible for this generation to return unchanged. Their torn nerves craved the anodynes of speed, excitement, and passion. They found themselves expected to accept the moral dicta of elders, living in a Pollyanna of rosy ideals which the war had killed for them. The potent imagery, the fluidity of characteristics, and the range of behaviors that were associated with the public profile of veterans throughout the interwar period, featured in the popular press, theater, and literature, was added to and shaped by the Hollywood film industry. The forces of change the veteran character represented fit well with the Hollywood industry, which in many ways symbolized those changes and profited from the stories and stars that relayed them. Just how neat a fit can be seen in a review of William Dieterle's The Last Flight in the Chicago Tribune, and that's where this is. I'll be talking more about that film in a minute. In the review by Matt Tenay, lauded the story of four aviators and a single lady, Nikki, who drink their way through Paris for its modern feel. Quote, "There's a vague, eerie Alice in Wonderland ish unreality about its biting reality, which makes the picture different from anything seen before. The oxymoron offers a clue into the meanings that veteran characters could convey. The reality of war experience on one hand, and on the other, the surreality of their charming yet aberrant behavior. Although the film culminates in a romantic coupling, the story of four cracked pilots following an ethereal and enigmatic woman through post-war Paris was slightly outside the norm. Their unreal behavior was motivated and at the same time legitimized by their real experiences in the air at the front. The article also illustrated the degree to which this behavior could be infectious, referring to the aviators as jangled bells out of tune. And this is from Hamlet. Actually, Ophelia talks about Hamlet as she thinks he's gone mad. And this appears actually in the article. The reader is assured that they will take them to their hearts, the veterans, and in the process, the article illustrated the broader traumatic appeal the war had on civilians. Nikki's behavior was also a tragedy of war's aftermath, the reviewer went, as was that of another character, Frink, who is actually not appearing in this particular bit, but I'll talk about him, who is a sort of a rotter of a journalist. I guess war made him that way too. Frink and Nikki have not seen combat, but they too are shaped by the war. In attributing these civilian characters' behavior to war experience, the article illustrates how any number of characteristics can be made plausible simply by invoking the war. What follows, and what I'm going to talk about, is an exploration of some of the ways veteran characters fit into the classical Hollywood style and how they presented timely opportunities for scriptwriters as a means of conveying a modern sensibility to breathe life into and refresh dependable storylines. Yes, Frink. This is Frink here. He's the rotter journalist. He's the only one who actually, well, he has desire for Nikki, and he's a bit of a stinker. Veteran characters from the Great War held the potential for mystery, pity, fear, depending upon their response to their experience of the hyperstimulus and trauma of total modern war. Consequently, the celluloid life of the Great War veteran was marked by a shift towards a recognition of the internal strife and social problems they faced that had, by the mid-1920s, become the prevailing theme in public discourse about their actual experience. These evolving characterizations, developed in response to the changing complexion of veterans' issues in the political and social realm, coincided with the establishment of the classical style of narration by the Hollywood studios. Well established by 1919, it emphasized clarity of storytelling through a character's traits and individual agency. Bordwell, Steiger, and Thompson, who I'm sure most of you know, point to the multiple reel feature as an important impetus, which by 1920 was a central part of the film program. Complex characterizations with plausible motivations and relationships with other characters were necessary to sustain a multiple reel film and ensure audience comprehension. In their 1920 book, How to Write a Screenplay, Anita Luce and John Emerson stressed the importance of providing the character with instantly recognizable traits. They suggested this come through action. A good method is to introduce important characters with some characteristic incident. The miser stoops to pick up a penny. The bully kicks a street urchin, and so forth. In his 1913 manual, The Technique of the Photoplay, Eepes Winthrop Sargent also emphasized the importance of setting up characters economically. Each time a new character comes upon the screen, there's a certain mental relaxation on the grip of the plot, while the identity of the newcomer is determined. Take advantage of that lapse to get the introduction over with, and then when the essential action comes, there's no drop in the interest, no matter how momentary. As you can see, I'm actually really interested in the way in which veterans operate in this kind of system. By including a war veteran in their screenplay, scriptwriters had to hand a condensed characterization that set up a wide choice of motivations. The veteran can behave in a heroic or villainous manner or act as a supporting character. They can behave erratically, and the fact that they have been to the front provides an open basis for motivation that scriptwriters can build on. Veteran characters' behavior in films between the wars varies greatly. However, the key to their modernizing effect was that they tended to refer directly or indirectly to the prevailing popular conversation about returning soldiers as a social and cultural concern. In the final scenes of Frank Borzegui's humoresque 1920, we see an early post-war example of utilizing the veteran as a means of providing motivation for the scene's dynamic interaction between the characters and bringing the narrative to a conclusion. In the final scene, the main character, Leon Canter, a promising concert violinist, returns from the war with a paralyzed arm. He is listless and apathetic until he's visited by his love interest, a singer, Gina Berg. As she leaves the room, he sees her silhouette collapse behind a curtained glass door. He's told her that he can never see her again. He says, "Why would you want me?" This is a particular trope. "Why would you want me? I'm a cripple." When she walks behind the door, he sees her collapse, and he jumps up and is miraculously cured by his love for her, because he then picks her up with his arm that had been paralyzed. The war, his experience, and his cure, however implausible, served to resolve the film's primary theme of mother love. I won't go into the film. It is a fascinating film, but that's all I can tell you right now. He basically transfers his love for his mother to Gina, real Freudian thing. So having Leon suffer from shell shock had the effect of building on the realism of the earlier scenes. His arm is paralyzed because it's hysterical. He's not really paralyzed. In the finished film, Leon actually suffered shrapnel in his arm, but there's an ambiguity which the titles explain. Months of suffering had driven the daylight from the mind of Leon Canter, and groping in the darkness, he struggled against that all-destroying fear that he could never use his wounded arm again. When Gina asks the doctor if he will recover, he replies, not in his present state of mind. The change of emphasis from physical injury to neurosis is significant. While inscribing an implausible action that seems to break the classical dictates, Leon's cure, when looked at closer, is made somewhat believable through its attribution to his war experience. 17 years later, in How to Write and Sell Film Stories, Frances Marion, this is just the scene where she brings him flowers and he's over here and his arm is paralyzed, and then he tells her to go away, and he then sees her collapse behind that door. Frances Marion wrote that motivation seldom needs to be shown in great detail. Give a suggestion of it, and if it is at all reasonable, the audience will accept the idea and carry it to its logical conclusion. Explanations for Leon's action in the film's ending are multiple and folded into one another. The most obvious is his love for Gina as catharsis, a jolt that revives the dominant nerves in his arm. It also chimes with a more forensic explanation of cure through catharsis. An appeal to activity that was prevalent in the immediate post-war popular discourse concerning neurosis. News reports such as that in the January 2nd, 1921 New York Times story about the opening of a new hospital in Perryville, Maryland for veterans with war neurosis outline the dynamics of symptom and cure for these men. Quote, the basis for whom is an emotional factor buried in their unconscious mind. They have lost confidence. Patients are therefore encouraged to indulge in various forms of activity provided for them. The article goes on to outline the path to finding the buried emotional factor through lengthy talking therapy, a combination of psychoanalytic and behavioral therapy that does, with some degree of accuracy, account for the medical approach at the time in the U.S. However, in Frances Marion's phrase, a suggestion that alludes to these explanations was enough in the case of Humoresque to be convincing to contemporary audiences. I want to talk now about how the veteran seems to represent certain kinds of time and how temporality is important. Temporality in the classical Hollywood model is important because the spectator needs to know how time is developing across the narrative. They don't need to know exactly how it's going while they're watching the film, but by the time the film's over, they need to be able to put it together. The veteran also embodies time, and veteran characters often work as a means of conveying its passage. The veteran's status as having been to war not only brings to the narrative a set of culturally resonant character traits, it also conveys recognizable references to both historical and story time. A veteran of a particular war, like the historical figure in a biopic, denotes the historical period of the narrative. The return of Ashley Wilkes from the war in Gone with the Wind denotes the time period as later in the Civil War, after Gettysburg. At the beginning of The Last Flight, the film I talked about earlier, the cuts from a crash following a dogfight to the hospital clock's minute hand approaching 11 a.m. and then to the two wounded pilots links the historical time with their experience and sets out the cause of the mental state of the characters that will be developed in the rest of the film. The veteran therefore offers the potential to build into the narrative a temporal marker and to establish historical setting and time that enables scriptwriters to embed the narration within a clear temporal progression without drawing its mechanics to the audience's attention. Leon's return in Humoresque after the armistice in November 1918 offers an early example of the use of the veteran and time in two ways: as a means of ensuring suspense and as a means of clearly demarcating the passing of time. Leon's announcement that he is enlisted provides a deadline for the romance plot with Gina. He will leave, possibly never to return, and therefore sets out the anticipation that the couple may or may not be able to express their feelings. This is a trope that you see all the time at this point. I'm going away. I may not come back. What are we going to do? In other films in the 1920s and the early sound period of the 30s, ellipses, or indications of duration through the off-screen experience of the veteran and the invocation of the war, are handled differently. Two film versions of Smiling Through, the 1922 version here, and then the 1932 MGM version, both directed by Sidney Franklin, offer an insight into the way that characterization of the veteran developed in relation to their experience as an off-screen traumatic event or experience. The films were actually adapted from a 1919 play written by Jane Cowell and Jane Murphy, under the pseudonym, of course, Alan Langdon Martin. And the play had been a profitable hit on Broadway that year, running 5 months from December 1919 to May 1920. Now, I'll just, I go through telling, I can tell you what actually happens. This is a story about, I'll go back to them. These are Norma Talmadge here and Norma Shearer here play a character called Kathleen. She is, this is Harrison Ford, actually. That's the name of the character. And this is Frederick March, and they play a character named John Carteret. The story begins with her uncle out in the garden, and I'll just show you a clip. I might as well, because it makes sense, and then it'll make sense to you. So this is the very beginning of the film, and Kathleen's uncle, who's played by Leslie Howard, has lost his wife at the altar due to the father of John Carteret, who came in and killed her right after as they got married. He goes out into his garden, and she appears.
Moon, if only I could be with you. If only I knew the way to you.
John, my dearest one. I'm always with you. I'm here whenever you need me.
What happens here, I just want to show you a little bit, because it's really a ghost story. And the first part of the film tells you how Kathleen gets into the Leslie Howard character's life. What then happens is he takes her in as and raises her as his own. She's his niece. And as she's grown up and she's a nice country girl, she's out riding, and they go to a castle, and she meets this American who is actually the son of the guy who killed Leslie Howard's wife. And so then what happens is he's come over to join the forces. He goes off to war, and he is rejected by the Leslie Howard character and her uncle, and he won't have anything to do with him because of who he is. And when he comes back, he finally accepts him. The Leslie Howard character dies, is reunited with his ghostly wife, and Norma Shearer and Frederick March, or the two couple finally get together. But the veteran comes back, and he's wounded. In both cases, there's a sense, again, we get that thing, how could you be with me? I'm a cripple. The temporal plot structure of the play and the 1922 film drew upon conventions of each medium to clearly indicate the time shifts. The play did this through its program. This is the program for it. Act 1 is in the garden. Act 2, he relays to Kathleen what happened 50 years before. And Act 3 is they go back to the present. And when Kenneth comes back from the war. The temporal structure also provided character motivation and emphasized the curative powers of woman and love among the fantasy of the Victorian English rural idyll, invoking a sensate nostalgia. By 1931, the hint of dissatisfaction with kind of ghostly whimsy, apparent in the film Daily Critique in 1922, that movie folk don't understand the idea of presenting spirits of dead people on the screen and may be inclined to laugh at the idea, it became more prominent. The shift toward realism in war films, as you get to the end of the 30s, marked by What Price Glory, 1926, Journey's End, 1930, All Quiet on the Western Front, play a part in this shift. The temporal structure of the Talmadge film maintained the play's, the 22 film, maintained the play's flavor of nostalgia, and from the evidence of its reception, ran counter to taste preferences for less sentimental fare. The fan magazine photoplay said that it was reminiscent of a gorgeous Valentine, one of those ornate celluloid and lace creations that remained in the drugstore window year after year because no one in town had enough money to buy it. While the review was favorable, praising its real feeling and enchanting beauty, the emphasis on its depiction of the past and the spiritualist overtones relegate it to the realm of a pleasant but lightweight confection. Kenneth's and Kathleen's characters were reworked in the 1932 version, and the temporality inherent in the send-off to the front and the veteran's return was given a sensual urgency that had the effect of modernizing this relationship. And I've looked at the production history of this of both versions, but the 1932 version is really full at the USC archive, MGM archive. And they brought in a guy named John Balderston, who was he was a script advisor. I mean, Thalberg, who produced the film, was very much into bringing lots of different script writers into a project. He wasn't happy with just one script writer. He'd get one draft, and then he would be sending it out. And quite often, even some of the like people like Anita Luce or Francis Marion, who were he always tried ideas out on them. They might have seen this and might have had something to say about it because they were on the MGM lot at the time. But Balderston, who had actually worked on Dracula and was no mean writer himself, offered his opinion of the script when he read it. The play dates remorselessly, but the theme is eternal. The public will always love romances in old gardens, youth parted by war, ghosts of lovers holding out to the survivors, threats of eternal separation. But current distrust of false sentimentality, current cynicism, the recent education of millions to expect better dramatic as well as technical mechanics and plausibility in their entertainment mean that when you present this picture, you will find audiences hoping that they are going to give them beauty, glamour, romance, but far more critical than even a few years ago, far more ready to resent cheap hokum and false laughs of a kind they would condone in other pictures, but not in this one, ready to grant you your ghosts, your old-fashioned tale, and to rejoice in them, provided you furnish a story they can believe and accept. Now, let's see, good, yeah. Balderston, he built his advice on the necessity of creating plausibility and character motivations, which in turn hinged on historical accuracy. These, he argued, would provide a structure of bones to this mass of jelly. For example, he drew attention to costume and pointed the experiences of women volunteers on the home front and criticized the use of glamorous costumes for Norma Shearer. No woman of her sort would have bought new clothes during the war. He applauds the use of the sound of thundering guns in France to drive home Kathleen's anxiety, and utilizing the veteran's connotation of historical time, he called for a montage that might indicate that Kenneth's return, along with that of other soldiers, happens in a time that closely follows the armistice. So he then goes on to what he does is he actually, the way he modernizes this story is through the veteran. This is how he does it. He says that, as indicated in the stage direction, Kenneth has the abnormal hatred of shell-shock patients of being cross-examined. So he gets really detailed about what shell-shock, what the kind of cultural meanings that were circulating around shell-shock soldiers. Since Owen, that's the doctor who meets him at the station when on his return, is a doctor, and he knows this. He doesn't ask questions. But when we cut to the scene where Owen tries to make him walk, he gets off the train. It's a long scene. I can't show it. But he gets off the train, and he doesn't want any help at all. And he tries to go, and then he falls down. He tells the doctor that he's not going back to see Kathleen. He's going to his house to pick up his belongings, and he's going back to America without her. He says... And so what Balderston says is, accordingly, it's right that when he collapses, he should break out and pour forth in one speech that the fact that he loves her too much to burden her with a wreck like himself, that he's no good, that he wishes he had been killed so that he could have died the man she loved. This does more than merely furnish a good climax to the scene, writes Balderston. It motivates Ken's behavior and wins him the pity, approbation, and respect of the audience. And it gets over a big difficulty to the advantage of the scene, and especially of the woman's part. The function in this of what Balderston manages to do is to push the film over onto Norma Shearer. Shearer was a huge star at the time, and she had actually made her name as a kind of risque flapper in the films like The Divorcee, and she was, and in this sense, it's kind of a casting against type. But one thing that happens in the film before he goes off is they have this conversation just as he's leaving. Kenneth says to her, "Oh, darling, I love you so." And they've already told her uncle, "Look, she said to her uncle, okay, I'm not going to see him. He's going off to war. Her uncle hates him. But they get together and he says, "I love you so." And she says, "Is that all?" He says, "All?" She says, "Don't you want me to? I want you. I'm not ashamed to say it. I'm yours. You're mine. I want that to be true before you go." What I think is important about this, and I will get down to my IS, the dialogue wasn't part of the 1922 film or the play, and it played to Shearer's star persona in previous films. The scene was central to the project of desentimentalizing the story, and the war setting made this possible. Kathleen Shearer can express her sexual desire because of the duress of the times, the urgency of the moment, the deadline of Kenneth's train leaving. This sensuality in the modern romance plot offers a further contrast with the spiritual romance of Moon and John 50 years earlier. Kathleen's and Kenneth's is a love with a real external deadline, while John and Moon deadline rests solely upon when he will recognize that his bitterness and hatred is the obstacle of their eternal happiness. One is spiritual, the other corporeal, and the hard deadlines of train departures, the threat to Kenneth's body and mind prompt the physical desire in both of them. These are examples of the temporal structure embedded in the wartime romance and the return of the veteran that ably aids the construction of the seamless narration of the classical style and ameliorates the sentimentality of the story. He goes on to talk about how that what he's been able to do is all this is not a motion picture war, but the real war as it affected the lives of people like this. We haven't 20 lines directly about the war in the film, but we show how the war affects, as it did, and it must. In this scene, what happens at the very end, he manages to get to the castle before she doesn't see him at the railway. She comes in, and he can't use his legs, but what he does is he sits down. And the thing that throws this film to her is that she doesn't know that he's crippled. And he goes into this thing, but "I don't love you anymore." It really was nothing. That really was nothing, get out. And she goes out in tears. And then the film kind of ends with she finally figures out what's happened and convinces him, and she helps him. And of course, what's interesting is she kind of, it's kind of interesting, maybe we could talk about this in questions, but what this does, because of course the other implication here is impotence. And this is Leslie Howard and Moon Yee. He's died playing dominoes in the garden, and she's come to get him just at the moment. It's a lovely, kind of lovely film. You can see why Balderston thought it could be a real stinker. But he introduces this kind of thing. What I want to talk about now is another film called The Last Flight, the one that I kind of began with. Balderston's formula for realism combined sexual sophistication with the consequences of war on the soldier's mind and body. This had been a theme evident in the emergence of the new American writing of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway in the mid-1920s. The central figures, Jay Gatsby in The Great Gatsby and Jake Barnes in The Sun Also Rises, were veterans dealing either directly or indirectly with their wartime experiences. For scriptwriters, the challenge in adapting Hemingway's story was to negotiate the matter of impotence in such a way as to provide plausible motivations for characters' actions. Jake Barnes' adventures, however, proved difficult to render under the studio system because of the central conflict being internal within Jake, whose consistent drinking and relative inaction left little room for heroics and resolution through action. More critically, the returning veteran and the attendant symptoms of this archetype had not yet been fully developed in terms of explicit delineations of the causes for their behavior. While alluded to in the conflicts that arise in films such as Humoresque and both versions of Smiling Through, impotence was a symptom of the traumatized veteran which was not explicitly discussed in most public forums. As with other symptoms entailing sexual dysfunction or sexuality, displacement strategies for talking around these topics were employed. Conrad Aiken's review of the novel, The Sun Also Rises, referred to the sordidness of the situation. In cinema, as in theater and literature, while ultimately displaced and usually resolved the symptoms of trauma were written on the body, Frederick March's darting eyes and Smiling Through provide plausible physical manifestations of war neuroses that were not possible with Jake Barnes. His impotence was his motivation. However, in 1930, in the adaptation of his popular stories Nicky and Her Warbirds, that John Monk Saunders wrote for Liberty magazine, he finds a way of writing around the psychological and physical problems suffered by veterans by displacing the impotence theme through an elusive slang. Suspiciously similar to The Sun Also Rises, it had at its center veterans infatuated with a woman, Nicky, who joined them traversing bars in Paris and Lisbon trying to drink to erase their symptoms of war trauma and impotence. Yet the story provided an acceptable solution by resetting the narrative problem from avoiding discussions of impotence to rekindling the desire in the main character as an indication of what his underlying problem had been. I think I'd like to see if I can just show you a clip from this film.
Oh, he didn't go. Oh, I'm so sorry. Your hand. Oh, your poor hand. Your poor, poor hand.
If you aren't the worst. First you insult his hands and make him mad. Then you cry over them and make him self-conscious. Come on back here. Come on. Well, that's torn it. He'll never come back now.
Then we'll have to find him.
What for?
To explain how sorry I am.
Well, you don't have to get so emotional about it.
Who's getting emotional?
You are. You're coming all apart. Here, take a drink of this. Make you laugh and play.
Say, what's she crying about?
She's crying on account of they didn't wash her strawberries this morning.
Didn't they wash your strawberries this morning?
The film uses elusive language. They'll be sitting drinking, and she'll get up to go somewhere and she'll go to the loo. And where are you going, Nicky? Well, I'm going for a Chinese singing lesson. I'm going to talk to a man about a horse. And this is what was so charming about the actual stories that then got put onto film. The stories were really loved by the reading public. For example, G.M. Ord writes in, "I was with these boys at the front in Paris and in the billets after the war. If our people could only understand your Nicky stories, what a difference it would make to these men. Many of them could be rehabilitated. They ought to be. They are brave, lovable, true soldiers, the debris of war. They ought to be in the hospital with many Nickys for nurses." Rather than go to tell you all about the story, because we can talk about it a bit later. But the novel and the film's signifying systems work to displace the flyer's impotence. All of them have problems. The guy you saw who said, what's wrong with her? He's got kind of an OCD, what we would call OCD. He's very excitable. Shep has a tick in his eye, and he wears glasses, and the only thing that stops the tick is drinking. And then another character called the Washout, or Francis, is clearly, he carries a clock with him because he keeps going to sleep. he has this kind of narcolepsy, which is kind of explained because he's into S&M in the novel, but not in the film. But Saunders sets out the psychological dynamics of the characters in the publicity material for the movie. He refers to the energy that veterans contain. He is still vibrant with surging nervous energy. Something in him clamors for wild action, for speed, for anything but humdrum. There's something in the bearing in the eye of an ex-airman which is instantly recognizable to others of his kind. Only those who've gone through the soul-shattering experience can see beneath the exterior of an ostensibly able-bodied and normal man and glimpse the tense spirit within. Tense spirit and surging nervous energy operate as plausible motivations for the behavior of the characters, a displacement that holds the solution to the representation and resolution of impotence in the film. Saunders' explanation incorporates a kind of crude topography of surface and interior, where only one who has undergone trauma can truly understand that turmoil resides in the veteran flyer. Only they can read the damage in each other the apparently calm surface hides. They each understand and share the tension between their headlong rush to oblivion, their need for comradeship, and their desire for Nicky. The resolution of those tensions depends in both the stories and the film on Nicky and on Carrie. Nicky is the genius loci of the film and acts as a guide as well as an object of the flyer's displaced and impotent desires. Empathy for the shell-shocked pilots is channeled through her knowing reference to her own and their bodies, with its elusive language about bodily functions and direct references to body parts. The film is suffused with corporeality. Throughout, Nicky herself is alluded to as being a victim of trauma at the hands of her mother, the symptoms of which are written on her body. She says, "I know I'm not good looking," when asked about her crooked tooth. She says it helps because when she is kissed too hard, her lip bleeds. So now I don't let anyone kiss me. In the film, this line is altered to, "I don't let anyone kiss me hard." When asked about her nicotine-stained teeth, she responds that they're not stained. "When I was a little girl, I was very ill once, and those are fever stains." When asked what was wrong with her, she responds, "My mother was a Christian Scientist, and she wouldn't tell me." In the stories, her eyes are described as unnaturally large and black and blind, like the eyes and the heads of girls painted by Marie Laurencin. I don't have a picture of them, but they are quite amazing pictures. They looked as though they had been treated with belladonna. The pupils were so dilated as to blot out the irises. So the castration impotence theme of the magazine stories, the novel, and the film highlight the way the specific patterns of motivation for characters work within parameters of a recognized public discourse. Yet the case of Nicky and her warbirds and its adaptation, The Last Flight, are explicit attempts to capitalize not only on the burgeoning image of the veteran as forgotten man, but also on the more sensational subject of the aberrant activity of damaged men. The Variety review of the film noted this and praised William Dieterle's first effort as for keeping the shell-shock side of the permanently wounded airman continuously before the audience. In the process, the figure of the veteran and the medical discourses which are embodied therein becomes the justification at the level of the script for varied forms of aberrant behavior, including the fetishization of women and the thinly veiled displacement of impotence on the physical symptoms of tics, drowsiness, and incessant drinking. Okay, I want to talk about one more film, and then I'll close. And this is one that you'll all know. This is a film called, this is the Grand Hotel. It was written by Vicky Baum and was a successful play in Berlin, was successful in London, and successful in Broadway. Thalberg saw it in its Los Angeles production and loved it, and immediately got Edmund Golding onto it. And the script conferences for this film exist; they're still around. And the film is it really is about 6 characters who are all staying in a hotel, and in the Grand Hotel in Berlin. And there's Grusenskaya, a ballet dancer who's seen better days, played by Greta Garbo. Baron von Geigern, played by John Barrymore, who is actually a veteran, but his family has lost all their money in the war. Then there's the stenographer, Joan Crawford, who is, actually these are publicity stills, especially that one there. She is the stenographer to the German industrialist played by Wallace Beery, von Preysing, who she basically acts as his typist, but she's really a prostitute. And then there's Lionel Barrymore, who was von Preysing's accountant, although von Preysing doesn't know it because he's such a jerk. What Lionel Barrymore's character has just found out, he has a terminal disease, and so he's going to live it up. He's taken all his savings, and he's going to live it up in the hotel. This is all centered, interestingly, I think, around one character, Dr. Otten Schlag, who is a veteran, who left half of his face on Flanders Fields. And they spend a good deal of time in this film. They don't describe him. He has almost no dialogue, but he's in the film and he floats around it. So I just want to show one very short clip.
Send her to Mr. Preysing's room, please. 166.
Yes, Dr. Simmons.
Letter for me?
No, doctor.
Telegram?
No, doctor.
He almost seems to be waiting for something, but it never happened.
No messages?
The war dropped
No,
him
doctor.
here and forgot him.
Oh, yes, I was in the war.
Your bill, Baron.
You're not beginning that again, are
Pay
you?
some attention to me. I have no time.
Kindly wait one moment, sir.
Oh.
Doctor, does anyone ask for me?
No, doctor. Yes, madam, we're holding the rooms now. 5 bedrooms and 2 sitting rooms. How many in your party, madam?
Let me see. There's my mother, 2 sisters,
Oh,
my
now,
secretary.
really, this is an
You will kindly wait one
imposition.
moment, please.
That makes 9.
Yes, madam. You wish to have the rooms held?
Yes, please. And then
Oh,
I'll
no,
let
I
you...
really, I won't wait any longer. I've been here a very long time.
Oh, that's all right.
Right. So, in the if you notice in that scene, what I create, the film itself is almost it's sort of geography and topography is circular. I'll show you some other things about it. It's a kind of network structure. In other words, the characters really have their own lives, and they're spinning off in lots of different directions, each one of them touched by the war in one way or another. But this character they tend to circulate around him. He stays in the hotel. He opens the film with the Grand Hotel, people come, people go, nothing ever happens. And at the end of the film, he ends the film like that, right in front of the revolving door. It was the character was meant to be played by the person who was sent to report on the play in Broadway. So she said that this is what you have to have. He has to maintain a certain weird rigidity, but without the usual of stage diabolism. So instead of giving this character, he says, instead of giving the character many lines at all, he just tends to articulate this utter cynicism. At one point, he says to Baron von Geigern, just sit in the lounge and watch the revolving door. You'd think it was crazed, in and out, in and out. Suppose you come in through the revolving door, you want to be sure you can get out again. He goes on to say he's a drug addict, he's a morphine addict, and he's kind of listless. He's like a black hole in the center of this film. He's not evil, he's just some kind of modern ennui. In his dialogue here, he's referring to his own life about the revolving door, and that he's got enough morphine to kill himself if he wants to. He can do that. He says this as they're reviving the terminal von Kringelline. So what you have then is an intersecting networks of souls just spiraling downwards. And they spend a lot of time on this set, the set design, and the camera work it swirls. It's a really, really interesting film, but often the character of Otten Schlag is not really talked about that much. It was in the play. The reviews of the New York play really focused on Otten Schlag, but Grand Hotel is often seen as a kind of Thalberg's big idea for putting a lot of stars in different films. So just to conclude then, what Grand Hotel does is inverts John Balderston's directions for modernizing the story of Smiling Through. Instead of filtering an old-fashioned story through the modern problems that washed up on the waves of post-war attitudes toward marriage, sexuality, mental illness, and ennoblement, Thalberg and Golding work into Baum's modern story their own understanding of film's audience's hopes and anticipations. Instead of walking out of the theater having seen an old-fashioned story with a modern treatment, they left having seen a nihilistic tale with beauty, glamour, and romance through the use of well-known stars, Cedric Gibbons' design, and the choreography of the camera and editing by William H. Daniels and Blanche Sewell, respectively. Maintaining buoyancy through the exotic mise-en-scène and enigmatic Dr. Otten Schlag allowed them to avoid the cheap hokum and false laughs that Balderston cautioned against. Such a strategy in Grand Hotel incorporated romance and sentimentality as a leavening device rather than a transcendent power. The characters disappear out of the revolving door at the end of the film to be replaced by a young American couple in motoring leathers and with attitude. They could be introducing a screwball comedy. The romance dissipates with the doctor's wry comment that nothing ever happens. Each of the veteran characters in Humoresque, Smiling Through, The Last Flight, and Grand Hotel demonstrate variant strategies of character motivation across the period between 1921 and 1932. I've tried to, through these examples, illustrate the classical system's dynamic relationship with the shifting public attitudes and discourses that surrounded the veteran. Leah Jacobs has argued that during the 1920s, with the rise of the new American literary voice, the studios were responding to broader shifts in taste preferences away from sentiment. She's noted that rather than completely suppressing it, sentiment persisted and existed within a dynamic with emerging modern sensibilities. These films, where the veteran plays a critical role in framing sentiment through a modernizing effect, offer some support for that argument. The veteran as a character in a system dependent upon plausible motivations, combined with the popularity of stories set around the war and its consequences, enabled a balance between sentiment and the real problems made manifest by it. The veteran character allowed a flexibility and latitude for scriptwriters that helped solve the problem of how to make a sentimental story current. What is evident in these examples is that those motivations have a historical specificity. In Humoresque, the cure for neurosis lay in the purity and intensity of love between Leon and Gina. It was a sentimental ending that added to a realist depiction of life in Jewish tenements in the Lower East Side. In the first version of Smiling Through, the treatment depended upon the star persona of Norma Talmadge as Flapper. A decade later, the second version incorporated the send-off as a means of allowing Norma Shearer to build on her already existing persona of a woman with desire. At the same time, the depiction of Kenneth's return allowed more sophisticated references to the pathologies of shell shock, as they were known at the time. Both of these factors modernized what script consultant John Balderston had called a remorselessly dated story. Finally, two films, The Last Flight and Grand Hotel, offered innovations through style and characterization that in different ways responded to the prevailing drift of taste preferences by invoking characters and settings imbued with the ennui of the lost generation. Each of these offer evidence through the role of the veteran characters and their desires and motivations of the ebb and flow of the afterimage of the war in the classical system. That's it.